Welcome to The American Story. Stories about all the things that make America the country we know and love. The American Story podcast is made possible through listener donations. You can simply visit our website at theamericanstorypodcast.org and click Donate. That's theamericanstorypodcast.org. Thanks to all of you in the land of the free who have given generously so that we can produce more stories and reach more listeners. This is Chris Flannery with the Claremont Institute. I call this one, Up From Slavery. He was an old black man, and I was an old white man. We were both native Angelenos, and had been just about old enough to drive around the time of the Watts riots in 1965. But that was half a century and a lifetime ago, and we hadn't known one another. Los Angeles is a big place, home to many worlds. Now we were white-haired professors reading a book together, and we became friends. His name was Kamasi. We were spending a week with a dozen other academics reading Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery. Booker T. Washington was born a slave in Franklin County, Virginia, just a few years before the Civil War began. With heroic determination, he got himself an education and went on to found the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama, where he remained principal for the rest of his life. By the time Frederick Douglass died in 1895, Washington was with no comparison the most well-known and influential black American living. By the beginning of the 20th century, as a biographer would write, he was one of the most powerful men in the United States. Up From Slavery, published in 1901, sold 100,000 copies before Washington died in 1915. It is a great American book. Modern Library ranks at number 3 on its list of the best nonfiction books in the English language in the 20th century. But there was a reason why Kamasi and I were reading this great book when we were old men, rather than when we were young men back in the riotous 60s. Even before Washington died, and while he was still the most famous and influential black man in America, other black leaders began to discredit him and question his way of dealing with the plight and aspirations of black Americans. These critics, who Washington sometimes called the intellectuals, were led by W.E.B. Du Bois, the first black American to receive a Ph.D. from Harvard and one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. So successful was this criticism that by the time Kamasi and I were in high school or heading off to college, the most fashionable opinion among intellectuals, black or white, was that Booker T. Washington was that worst of things for a black man. He was an Uncle Tom. How Uncle Tom came to be a term of derision, rather than the name of a heroic character, is a story for another time. And so if Washington's great book was mentioned at all to young Kamasi or me, it was mentioned in this negative light. But fashions change, and as Washington himself taught, merit is hard to resist. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address were dismissed and scoffed at by some intellectuals in his day, and are now generally recognized by informed and intelligent people around the world as the great speeches that they are. Huckleberry Finn scandalized polite opinion when it came out, because it was about an illiterate vagrant and other lowlifes, and contained a lot of ungrammatical talk and bad spelling. A couple of generations later, Ernest Hemingway himself declared that all modern American literature comes from one book, Huckleberry Finn. A couple of generations later still, in our own times, skittish librarians would be removing the book from their shelves because it used a language too dangerous for children. The study of the past should shed light on what deserves praise, what deserves blame, and the grounds on which such judgment should be made. Americans, being as fallible as the rest of mankind, as long as we are free to air opinions, there will be different opinions among us, some of which may actually be true, and they will change from time to time, sometimes for good reasons. In recent years, several scholars have helped bring back to light the greatness and goodness of Booker T. Washington. Even fashionable opinion is capable of justice, and no one wants to be deceived about what is truly good and great. So I hazard to predict that it will soon become fashionable to recognize Booker T. Washington again as one of the greatest Americans ever. Washington never held political office, but his life and work demonstrated that you don't have to hold political office to be a statesman, and that the noblest work of the statesman is to teach. The soul of what Washington sought to teach was that we too can rise up from slavery. It is an eternal possibility. That was a central purpose of Booker T. Washington's life and work, to liberate souls from enslavement to ignorance, prejudice, and degrading passions, the kind of slavery that makes us tyrants to those around us in the world we live in. Washington saw that this freedom of soul cannot be given to us by others. Good teachers and good parents and friends, through precept and example, can help us see this freedom and understand it, but we have to achieve it for ourselves. When we do, our souls are liberated to rule themselves by reflection and choice, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Read up from slavery. You will be reading an American classic, and will be getting to know a man who, in the quality of his mind and character, and in the significance of what he did in and with his life, ranks among the greatest Americans of all time, even with the man whose name he chose for himself. When we read this great book together in our advanced years, Kamasi, who always wore his heart on his sleeve, wept frequently and repeated, shaking his head, "I lived a life not knowing this man." Thanks for being part of the American Story. This is Chris Flannery with the Claremont Institute. I encourage you to visit our website, theamericanstorypodcast.org, to learn more about these stories and how you might support them. That's theamericanstorypodcast.org.